welcome to the United States Catholic Mission Association on the webinar with Tony Gittins. I'm going to share my screen here in a moment. We're going to have an opening prayer. And I was wondering if I could impose upon you, Noreen. Noreen, you just happen to be underneath me on the screen. If you would be kind enough to unmute yourself and lead us in this really wonderful opening prayer that Tony has provided for us.
Jesus says that in his society, there is a new way for people to live. You show wisdom by trusting people. You handle leadership by serving.
They can increase the value.
She's saying the prayer, Jeannie.
You handle money by sharing. You handle authority by gentle firmness. You handle enemies by loving. You handle violence by suffering. In fact, you have a new attitude toward everything, toward everybody, toward nature, toward the state in which you happen to live, toward women, toward refugees, asylum seekers, marginalized and homeless people, toward all and every single thing. Because this is a Jesus society. And you repent, not by feeling bad, but by thinking and acting differently.
Let the church say amen.
Amen.
Noreen, thank you very much for that. We want to get right to Tony's presentation. I'd like to make sure that everybody, please mute yourself because we're hearing your background noise and we don't want to distract from Tony's presentation. So with that, I'm going to make Tony our spotlight person. And Tony,
yeah,
the presentation is yours.
Thank you. I can see Jesus on my screen, but I can't see me on my screen, which is fine by me. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this. Am I coming through okay, Don?
You're coming in fine, Tony.
Okay, fine. That little prayer that I borrowed from a Canadian author finishes by saying, you repent not by feeling bad, but by thinking differently. And I like it because we Catholics are very good at feeling bad, and we're not very good at thinking differently. And in fact, it's a whole lot more challenging to think differently than it is to feel bad. We can feel bad very, very easily, and then we can feel bad time and time again. So what we're talking about today is a challenge to think differently, but again, not just to leave it there, but to think differently in order to act differently. So let me start off by telling you what I'm not going to talk about. I'm not going to talk about the experience that we have as we encounter other people as missionaries to the other. In other words, when the other is somebody else and we are going to them. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about what happens when we ourselves are othered among others within our own community. So the way to get to that is to say, I'm talking about people who belong to international religious communities of men or women, but I'm talking particularly about the dynamics of day-to-day living within one's community, where there are people of many or a few or several cultures under the same roof, living as part of an international community, but actually in a local community, not just a monocultural group, but a group with one or more people of different cultures. And I'm talking about the challenge to everybody to think differently and to act differently. And the critical distinction to make is between an old model of living, which used to be referred to as assimilation, according to which we accepted people who were different, so long as they understood that we were in control and we were in charge and we were going to tell them how to do things. That model of assimilation is really dead. It isn't buried, unfortunately, but it is dead. And we have to move to another model, which I'm referring to and will refer to in a minute as radical inclusion, where everybody is valued for their differences and not just for their conformity to our expectations. So we're going to start off, and because of time constraints, I have to do this in a very, very swift kind of way. And the first thing I want to look at is this handout that Don will put up on the screen for everybody to see. And I've got 4 handouts, and I will just kind of put them on the screen and then go through them systematically, and that will leave time for conversation and particularly for questions. One of the things that I won't explicitly refer to in this half hour is the position and the challenge to the older members of the community who constitute membership of what we might call the dominant culture. So most of us participating today are in the aging category and in the category of members of a dominant culture living in a community where most people are like us. In other words, a bit old and a bit dominant culture. But we may find ourselves in communities where there are 1 or 2 other brothers or sisters from other cultures. And one of the questions is going to be, what can we hope for? What can we expect from the aging members? In other words, I'm going to be asking an awful lot from not only the younger members today, but the members in the future who are going to be carrying the heavy load of trying to live in an intercultural fashion. But that does not mean to say that marginalizes the old or the sick or the infirm or the dying within our communities today. Now, I don't particularly like the word interculturality because it's a kind of stated thing. It's a static thing. I want to use the phrase intercultural living. And everything I'm going to talk about today is about how we live in our communities. And the first handout we've got is called Introduction to Intercultural Workshop. And the first question is the twofold question: can you distinguish international and intercultural? And can you distinguish multicultural and cross-cultural? Just give it a little visualization, a little thought for the moment. Visualize international and see if you can visualize intercultural, a community. And then see if you can visualize a multicultural community and distinguish it from a cross-cultural community. These are on the screen, Don, yeah?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the first distinction I need to make is in relation to those by saying the first in each of those pairs is a word that comes from the field of sociology or social anthropology or just social conversation. The word international has nothing whatsoever to do with God explicitly. But the second word in each of these two, the way we're going to be using it today and the way they are used in the field of intercultural studies, the second of each of these pairs is a theological word. The word intercultural has something to do with God, something to do with theology, something to do with faith, something to do with the dynamic way in which we live our discipleship. So international simply refers to a group that happens to be comprised of people who have different passports. That's all. Intercultural, the way I'm going to be using it today, is something to do with the way people who are in fact people carrying different passports, some of them carrying the same passport, some carrying different passports, the way in which they live out their faith through their own particular culture. Whether we're talking about the culture of two people that is basically, say, American, one of whom, however, happens to be 85 years of age, and the other happens to be 25 years of age, there's a difference in culture, at least in subculture. Or the difference between somebody in a community who is healthy and active and somebody in the community who is sick and dying. They again are living in the same community, but they are of different subcultures. So they are living in an interculturally challenging community, a community challenged to live interculturally or challenged to intercultural living. So the word intercultural is a theological word, the way we're going to use it. And likewise, the word cross-cultural is a theological word, the way we're going to use it. In ordinary parlance, cross-cultural and multicultural both come from the field of social science or the field of anthropology. Multicultural simply means people of different cultures living in the same vicinity. And cross-cultural means culture of people of one culture living among people of another culture, intentionally having crossed over from his or her own homeland to become an outsider or a foreigner in somebody else's homeland. So the cross-cultural person of his or herself has nothing to do with theology. But the way we're using it today in relation to intercultural living assumes that the cross-cultural person that we are talking about is cross-cultural because of a faith or a discipleship commitment, that we are cross-cultural by calling, by missionary calling. And that means to say that we have a God perspective of our cross-cultural living. The rest of the page, I just have to go through quickly. You can read it faster than I can say it. So what I'll do is I'll just hit on one or two of the major points as we go through preliminary thoughts. The first one is very simply, intercultural living is about the way we live our discipleship, not just about the fact that we live with other people who are different from us in some way. The second point is that faith is not just something that we hold in a theoretical or an abstract way. Faith is lived. And when faith is lived, we call it discipleship. So lived faith is what we're talking about when we're talking about intercultural living. How do I live my faith on a day-to-day basis with other people who are committed, as I am, to living my faith with otherness in my own community? The third one is that faith can only be expressed culturally. We express our faith through the way we live, through the habits that we have, through the behavior that we have, through the symbols we have, through the morality we have, through the beauty that we see, and so on and so forth. All of that is cultural. And our faith can only be expressed culturally. So as we encounter people of different cultures, and as we ourselves, as persons of culture, encounter other people of different cultures, so our lived faith is kind of shared, but in different ways. We are one Lord, we are one faith, we are one baptism, but we are different people with different cultures and different expressions of discipleship. And intercultural living is about the way in which we bring together our differences. We don't hide our differences. We don't live in spite of our differences. We engage in our differences, and we realize that our differences are God-given. It is God who creates difference. And if God creates difference, then difference is good. But we human beings are a little bit worried about difference, and we think difference is bad. So that if we see something different from our familiar way of thinking or acting, we kind of think that somebody else needs to change, because the way our way of thinking, the way we think and the way we act is evidently the right way. And sometimes we think that that is the only way, or certainly the best way to think. Intercultural living is about learning to live with and to exploit to the best of our ability our differences. So number 4 is like a little bit of a definition. Intercultural living is A, authentic discipleship, lived B, by culturally different people, C, together. So intercultural living is different from multicultural living. Multicultural living is just a matter of people of different cultures maybe living under the same roof. But I sometimes characterize multicultural living as people living together separately. And that's unfortunately one of the characteristics of a lot of religious life. people living together separately. We are multicultural, but we are not intercultural. Intercultural is people living together. And that's very different from people living semi-independent lives under the same roof and calling it community living and even calling it interculturality. It's not interculturality. It would be interculturality, but we have a long, long way to go before we get to real interculturality. Number 5, if we see intercultural living as a problem, we will not address it adequately. We have to see it positively, as a challenge. And if we see it positively as a challenge, it is something that each and every single one of us is called to engage in our different ways. It is not theirs or somebody else's. It is our challenge for the future for religious life. And I'll talk about that very specifically. So if we live in an us and them world where we polarize and oppose people of different cultures or different, whatever it is, different differences, if we live in an us and them world, we will never find a way to live as an intercultural community. Only when we live in a we world. And you see that best expressed in the letter to the Ephesians in chapter 2, where the writer of the letter to the Ephesians says, Jesus came into a divided world, an us and them world, but he removed the barrier between us and them by placing himself right there, so that with one hand he could reach out to us, and with the other hand he could reach out to them and bring us and them together as we. And that's the hope for an integrated world of intercultural living. Number 6 is again calling us back to the notion that this is a faith-based enterprise. It does not come naturally, but with faith, hope, and charity, it may come supernaturally. Number 7, likewise, it is not easy, but it is desirable because God desires to bring us all into one community, living in unity. And that is to say that everybody is called to conversion. It is not good enough to feel bad. We absolutely have to think and act differently. Number 8 is critically important insofar as to remind us that goodwill has done disastrous things in our history. Goodwill is not enough. We need more than goodwill. We need skills, we need virtues, we need God, we need conversion. Number 9, it requires a common vision, and I'll leave that and come back to that in a couple of minutes. Number 10, intentional, that's the operative word, intentional intercultural living is something new for most people, because we have very often lived in foreign lands in mission, but in monocultural communities, very often, historically. I'm talking about particularly pre-Vatican II. But now increasingly, where international religious orders are flourishing and drawing new members, they are from many, many different cultures. And the challenge then is to integrate those many different cultures into single communities so that we don't just have monocultural communities, but we have intercultural communities. So it's new for many people. But my statement, my premise, my thesis is that intercultural living is the future of international religious life. It's not the future of national or parochial or diocesan religious life, which can very well be monocultural. But international religious life needs to become intercultural. Otherwise, it will fragment back into its constituent parts: tribalism, factionalism, opposition, us and themness. Okay, so if there is to be a future, an authentic future for international religious life, we have to find a way to live interculturally, or else we will simply go into our own little enclaves. However, number 12, it is not only for international communities. There are many other applications, particularly in multicultural parishes and so on and so forth, but we haven't, that's not our focus for today. But in general, you could say that intercultural living constitutes a challenge for anybody living and ministering to the other or an other. And then the final statement or contention is that this is in the process of trying to create a revolution in religious life or religious living. Okay, that's the kind of outline of the challenge of intercultural living. I have to be very careful about the time, and I'm going to move on briefly to the second of the handouts, which again is something that you can internalize fairly readily. We simply distinguish between monocultural, cross-cultural, multicultural, and intercultural living diagrammatically. The first one, monocultural living, we can define that as a defined area. I'm talking about the A people living in a bounded area. That boundary is porous, however. We're not living in a prison where only A people live, but we are living in a place where A people can identify themselves with other A people as people with common interest, common belief, common history, common language, common values, what have you. And when we talk about a monocultural community, we are usually talking about a community that shares somewhere in the region of 70 or more % of its understanding of the world and its way of relating to the world and persons with other people. So I can identify English British people and English-speaking American people as people of the same culture, insofar as we can share 70 or more % of our expectations and understandings. But I can distinguish us from each other insofar as I can identify the things that distinguish us. And similarly with people, from Australia, or people from South Africa, or people from parts of Africa. In some cases, I can identify myself as part of a monoculture with some of them, some of the time. And then at other times, I can identify myself as different from them. I am an A person, and they are a B person. Or they are an A person and I am a B person. And that's perfectly legitimate. That's the monocultural person living in a monocultural world. The cross-cultural person is a person of culture A who intentionally and deliberately crosses that boundary, that porous boundary or border between culture A and cultural B, in order to insert him or herself as an A person in a B culture. In other words, I can write a little letter A in the B square of cross-cultural living to remind myself that if I am the A person, I am the minority. I am the outsider. They are at home. I have left home. They are in their own place. I am out of place. I am the stranger. They are the host. The cross-cultural person then is the person who deliberately and intentionally undertakes to be that person, the minority person, the outsider, the stranger, in somebody else's culture. And I want to use the word cross-cultural in this particular conversation today to mean a theological term, meaning that I am inspired to be cross-cultural by virtue of my calling, my vocation. Okay. And when we come to identifying an intercultural community, everybody has to be already or in the process of becoming a intentional cross-cultural person, partly out of place, partly not at home. We'll see that in a minute. The third one is multicultural living. And I've made the lines between A, B, and C and D vertical lines, closed lines, okay? Which is to indicate that multicultural living can be very easily people of different cultures living in the same vicinity, but separated from each other, basically living together separately, all right? The A people not particularly interested in, certainly not learning the languages of the Bs or the Cs or the Ds, and similarly for the others. So living together separately, multicultural. And now we come on to intercultural living, and the diagram finally is more interesting and more complex. Don, will you just raise that one? You'll see we've got A people, B people, C people, and D people living in the same vicinity. They are separated from each other by broken lines. The lines are porous, which means to say that people can intersect and interact with each other. But the characteristic of an intercultural community is that everybody intentionally commits themselves to a relationship with everybody else. So the A person is directly related to the B people and the C people and the D people. And the B people is directly related to the A people and the B people and the C people and the D people, and so on. And the consequence of that is, if I show you my diagram, which is slightly different from the one that's on the thing now, what I've done with that final number 4 is to insert the letter E to cover A, B, C, and D, which is to say that in an intercultural community, the A people remain A people, but become part of a new community, which we can call the E community, which is nobody's natural community, but everybody is joining it as an outsider, as an A or a B or a B or a C or a D person. So you are creating a new unit. And the best example of that new unit is a family, starting off with a husband and wife and finishing off 25 years later with a mother and father and 4 or 5 growing or grown children. And over that period of 20 years or so, we have an organic movement that changes husband and wife, and then one by one, children, into a membership of a growing community. That community did not exist at the beginning. It was only A and B getting married and then producing children. And now 20 years later, we have a family, and the family has changed everybody, and everybody is modified by everybody else in the family. That's an image of an intercultural community, a growing, organic, changing over time community, which nobody can claim as absolutely their own, but which everybody can claim as home. It is not their only home, and it is not their absolute entitlement, but it is what has grown together organically over the period of a wedding becoming a marriage and a marriage becoming a family. And that is a kind of image of intercultural living. I've only got about 7 minutes left, so I'll use it very quickly by going to our third handout, which is about a vision. And to do this, I'm very briefly going to write the word vision on my piece of paper. And I'm going to say that every community needs a vision. There's the vision, okay? But the vision that every community needs is not each individual's vision. The vision I'm talking about is the community's understanding of God's vision for the community. So I've left it open-ended. There's no boundaries there. It's just open-ended, the word vision. And we are trying as a community to get a glimpse of God's vision for this mixed community, this existential mixed community. And when I talk about an existential mixed community, I'm talking about something that exists as a structure. And I'm going to write the word structure at the bottom of my page. And I'm going to show you that at the bottom of the page is the word structure, and at the top of the page is the word vision. Now, I'll tell you what the structure is in a minute, but the structure, the purpose of a structure is to serve the vision and to keep the vision alive. That's the purpose of the structure. And when I talk about a structure, I'm talking about your community and my community. The purpose of your community and my community is to be faithful to our understanding, our changing understanding of God's vision for us. So what is our structure? Our structure is twofold. First of all, it's actually our membership, our real membership. Who are we? How can the people we actually are live out God's vision for us in mission? So look around and ask yourself, how many do we have in our community as a whole? How many are what age? How many are young and active? How many are older? How many are retired? How many are sick? How many are dying? What is our structure? And then we can ask ourselves some concrete questions. What can we hope that this structure can do to keep the vision of God alive? If we were 100 people, all under the age of 40 and very active, then presumably our understanding of how we could remain faithful to the vision would be very different than if we're 25 people, 19 of whom are over the age of 80. It's not to say that the 19 cannot keep the vision alive. It's just to say that the structure will limit how we remain faithful to the vision. The second part of structure, whose job is to keep the vision alive, is our actual institutional organization. Not how many people only do we have, but what is our property? How much money do we have? What are our resources? What can we do? Maybe in a different time, in a different place, we had different resources, and therefore we could do differently. We could be faithful to the vision in a different way. So who are we now structurally? How are we limited? And what potential do we have with our structures? There's enormous potential with age and aging that is not realizable with young and active people, or it is realizable in a different kind of way. So the first question is, how does our current structure, or how can our current structure keep the vision alive? But then secondly, structures always generate strategies. And the purpose of strategies is the same as the purpose of structure. The strategies come in between the structure and the vision, and the strategies likewise serve to keep the vision alive. So we put in place strategies. From our provincial meetings to our general chapters, we create new strategies. Why? So that we can keep the vision alive, so that we can remain faithful to the mission. But just as sometimes our structures fail to keep the vision alive because we live in structures that are outmoded and should have been abandoned years ago, or our structures are limited by our age or our numbers, and we have not modified our expectations and our faithfulness to the vision accordingly, so our strategies can also sometimes get in the way of the vision. Some of the things that we're doing because we decided to do them 10 or 20 or more years ago when they had a purpose. Maybe the purpose is fulfilled now. Maybe they're no longer keeping us faithful to the vision. So our strategies need to be rethought and redeveloped to make sure that our strategy's purpose is to keep the vision alive, just as our own structures, our personnel, and our properties and so on need to be constantly scrutinized to ensure that as we are in our existential situation, we are being faithful to the vision, which means to say that intercultural living is not dependent on a lot of money or a lot of people or a lot of youth. Intercultural living is dependent on a lot of faithfulness to our structures and our vision of God's vision for us. And intercultural living is subject to or limited by our strategies and our faithfulness to those strategies. Now, the paper that you have there on A Vision Must Be is something that you can read privately, but the idea behind it is to convince us all that each and every person in the community is necessary and valued. And we cannot have an intercultural community where some are important and some are regarded as unimportant or marginal or marginalized. And that basically is the end of the presentation, except to say in 4 minutes, what might be a vision, our vision of God's vision of the outcome of all this. And for that, we have the final handout. And the final handout is going to be a way for us to try and visualize a movement And you'll see that the movement is, as the title suggests, from invitation to radical welcome. That's the title of the page. And at the top of the page, you've got 3 words: invitation, inclusion, and radical welcome. And I want to move us from the first one to the last one. And then down the side of the page, you have 4 statements: the message, the purpose, the cost, and the outcome. And I want to move us there through those 4. So we start at the top left quarter, where we have a community, and an international religious community of missionaries who have operated traditionally in a certain kind of way, and we call this a community of invitation. The message of that community would be, come and join us and share the riches of our cultural and religious tradition. Seems to be a perfectly good message. The purpose, however, shows that there are flaws here. The purpose traditionally was a model that we referred to as the assimilation model, which was that we invite new people to become part of our community. The implicit thing is our community pre-exists. You may come and join it. We will invite you to join us, but we have the rules, we have the tradition, we have the formation, and you adapt to us. You assimilate to us. So what is the cost in that case? I'm talking particularly about the pre-Vatican II community that the vast majority of us are familiar with here. What was the outcome? Well, encouraging numbers, but the community remained very monocultural. Those who were different were marginalized or moving us up. Donald, moving the model up. The page. Don, can you move the page up? Yeah, there you go. So encouraging the numbers, but the community remains very monocultural, and people who are different are marginalized or overlooked. The experience of people of my age would be very familiar with that idea. You come and you conform. If you conform, you may pass through to the next stage. If you don't conform, for whatever reason, you don't stay. And we can manage perfectly well because there are plenty more where you came from. That's a model of religious assimilation, which was current, and in fact, in many cases, very largely the only model in the pre-Vatican II church. Now, if you go up to the top again and move to the middle column, we have a community of inclusion, which is a modification of the first one. Here, the message is, come and join our community and help us to diversify internally and internationally, which is well said. It's easy to say, but it's not always well put into practice. So the purpose here is not assimilation, but incorporation. And the marginal others, the people who join us, who are different from the majority of us, they are welcome, but the community doesn't change. The community behavior stays the same. The community customs, food, prayer, timing, behavior, expectations, rewards and punishments, language stay the same. And people have to adapt. Okay? So we move down to the next quarter. What is the cost in this community of inclusion? And the cost is some cost now to the community because it preaches inclusion, but it doesn't always practice what it preaches. And it doesn't practice power analysis or self-analysis. Minorities don't become part of the authority structure, part of the responsibility structure. They are marginalized, and very often, they are left to fend for themselves or left in menial jobs. And to a significant degree, with a few exceptions, individuals just sink or swim. Okay, you just have to make it, and if you can't make it, well, okay, you don't stay in the community. So the outcome then becomes that there's a high turnover of members. Whoever doesn't conform or adapt or become part of the dominant culture is either muted or made to leave. Keep quiet, conform, if you want to stay or leave. And the community as a whole remains largely a dominant culture and a dominant language, monocultural community, with very few exceptions, which finally leads us to a hoped for vision of an intercultural community that we call a community of radical welcome. Here, explicitly, the community says, the message is bring your cultural and religious values, bring your differences and your voice and yourself, and help us to become what we are not yet. Help us to become intercultural rather than monocultural or dominant cultural. Okay. So the message is very different. And the purpose is achieved in a different way. We're now talking about an incarnated community. The community is organically transformed, as a family is. Each person becoming themselves and contributing to the community as a whole. So each person being transformed by everybody else. Younger sisters, older brothers, parents, so on and so forth. Each person is transformed by the other members' talents and faith commitment. And then thirdly, the cost is significant to the community as it strives to practice real inclusion and be mutually enriched through the infusion of new and culturally different ways of living the faith. This last point is absolutely critical. Culturally different ways of living the same faith. This is enriching to the church. And if we continue to resist it, we will be a very bland monocultural church. The riches of the intercultural faith are absolutely immeasurable. And we have them at our fingertip as we are recruiting or accepting members from different cultures whose expressions of faith are so different from our own and so enriching as ours, I hope, can be for them. And then finally, we're back to the idea of a family, and the outcome is that the community evolves organically. Difference is dignified and valued. Authority does not dominate, but respects all. And there is a common commitment and spirit. And we're back to our vision of God's vision for us, realized existentially in this particular community at this particular time, whether we are rich or poor, many or few, healthy or weak, but real and committed and faithful religious missionaries. Let the people say amen. Amen. All right.
Tony, thank you very much. It was incredibly stimulating. I'm going to go ahead and stop the sharing of it. And so people are saying amen in the chat room. One question did come up through the chat, and feel free to ask the questions in the chat. We have a few minutes here. Someone observed that culture has been thought as primarily as ethnic, and you seem to be saying that it includes generational differences and the stage of life differences. Could you expand on what does cultural difference include?
All right. Culture is about the way we see the world, the way we understand the meaning. It's about meaning making, how we share meaning, how we receive meaning, how we are told what things mean. Our parents tell us what things mean. It's important to remember nobody is born with culture. Everybody has culture, and culture is mediated to us. It's about our values, our morality, our symbolism, our liturgy, our music, our poetry, our sin, our grace. Every culture has sin and grace. It's about all of those things that give meaning and give stability and give the opposite of stability, instability to people. But culture is essentially about the way people live together in groups, where they have 70% or thereabouts of their understanding of the world and its meaning, which includes religion, in common. A common culture is where there is a common set of values or at least an overlapping set of values. And then within every culture, since no two people in the world see things exactly the same, within every broad culture where you've got something like a 70% overlap of interchangeable and exchangeable ideas and meanings and language and so on, you have subcultures. And subcultures are those groups within a culture that make meaning for themselves, like a prison or a hospital or a group of adolescents or a group of people in a retirement home or a local religious community. Okay, so subcultures are groups of people who make meaning with other people of membership of a like group. So if I'm an old person, I have a natural affinity with other old people that I don't naturally have with people of 25. And if I'm a 25-year-old person, I have a natural affinity with people who are around my age that I don't have with people who are different. And the same for health or sick or freedom or refugees or all kinds of things. I can talk about subcultures as groups of people who share a significant amount of their meaning making and understanding and interpretation of the world with others. Okay, so we can talk about broad culture and subculture. And within every local community, and I'm not just talking about religious community, there are subcultures. With every family, there's a subculture. Adolescents and parents, subcultures.
Thank you, Tony. Another question was, could you name what might be asked of the one coming into a community of and or in, and the one in the dominant culture, and of the ones receiving that person? So what's being asked of the person coming in, and what's being asked of the group that's receiving?
Okay, great, lovely. The person coming in, of course, is asked to come into a program of formation, which helps to assimilate a person into a culture, a religious culture, okay? But not at the expense of their own identity. So what is expected of the formators is not to turn the formation people into clones of themselves, but to help them to become members of a common culture, a common community, and to challenge the formators to reinterpret their own understanding of their own culture, their own religious culture, so that it is broad enough to incorporate the otherness of the other, and at the same time, the shared faith that we have with the other. In other words, we are both the same and different. The person knocking on the door, seeking formation, is seeking to learn our culture to the point where he or she can identify with it as part of their own individual call to mission. Not so that they can abrogate their own culture, not so that they can forget their own call to mission. They may find that they're very interested in the call to mission, but it is not their call to mission. So they will go and they'll find another formation community that will form them in something that seems to them to be more consistent with their understanding of God's vision for them. But meanwhile, the formators have always got to be aware that you repent not by thinking bad and regretting what you've done in the past, but by thinking differently. And the way formators are called to think differently today is enormously challenging compared with the way formators were called to think when I was a formator badly 45 years ago. Because I was thinking with a different set of thoughts and a different set of criteria. And I was very much on the model of assimilation. Added to which, the vast majority of people in formation were young people, only just post-adolescent. Nowadays, they're adults. And you cannot treat an adult the way you treat a post-adolescent. Different culture. So, you can elaborate that.
Right.
I know this about.
Another question, Tony, was how do you start to transform decision-making processes that would include or involve other cultural methods?
Well, that's where you have to deconstruct and reconstruct your own cultural understanding. That's why books on intercultural living are written largely by people of my own ilk, which is to say people who come from the field of sociology or anthropology, who are adapting the language of sociology and anthropology to the language of mission, which is theological language, which is why I'm saying these are words that have already been used in other disciplines, but are now being used, in the theological disciplines. So the question of authority and structures has all got to be and deconstructed by us examining our own cultural presuppositions and our own cultural behaviors. And the sad thing is, in a sense, that we very often think that, when we become cross-cultural missionaries, we perfectly well understand that we need to learn another language, and we do that systematically. But we very often assume that we will understand the culture almost intuitively, and that's nonsense. We've got to learn other people's cultures. And people in formation today, whether formators or formated, have got to learn the culture of each other. And that's a lot of learning, to try and learn the thought of a contemporary 21st century, 25 or 35-year-old person. And I can't just do it by wishful thinking or goodwill. And I do it partly by dialogue and partly by a serious attempt to do an anthropological understanding of today's people, just as I would do an anthropological understanding of some so-called exotic people miles away from home. That's what anthropologists do. They spend years trying to figure out who these people are. And yet we accept people into our communities and we think we already know who they are.
Right. Another question is kind of the observation that culture itself is dynamic. It's always
Absolutely.
Changing and growing.
Absolutely.
And how do we kind of discern, is this something that the culture is trying out, or is this something new that the culture has appropriated?
Exactly.
How do you kind of say, okay, this is now part of the culture, or it's just being experimented with?
Yeah, good question. And that's, again, a theological question. That is precisely a question of discernment. We are trying to determine whether something of culture is acceptable in religious life. Not simply whether something of culture is okay, but whether it is acceptable as part of our culture, our religious life culture. All right. So there may be many, many things that are perfectly okay culturally, but they are not necessarily consistent with our understanding of God's vision for us as religious missionaries. And there's a major ongoing question of discernment for people in formation. How much can we be fashionable, or can we simply modify what we used to do? And how much have we got to stay with our understanding of gospel values? And how do we work out what really are the gospel values that are non-negotiable? There's the ongoing question, and each different community will see it slightly differently, depending upon the objective of each community, okay, in relation to the secular world or the otherness of other people. So there is a huge ongoing question. Yeah.
Thank you, Tony. Last question, given our time, and I have a few announcements at the end here. So the question is really the relationship between a congregation's charism and the vision, as you were talking about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, again, it's like an organic development. It's trying to understand, is my charism fixed in stone? Or does my charism represent a way in which my community is responding to God's call to mission in the specific context of my own community? And pretty well every community that's existed for more than one or two generations has modified organically its articulation of its charism. Why? Because the world it was founded for has changed. If you were founded for orphan girls or women in prostitution 150 years ago, then if you're faithful to your charism today in a changing world, you have got to find a way to modify that. Okay, it's remaining faithful to the theme, to the call, to the marginalized, let's say, but in a different kind of way as institutions change and as culture changes. In the days gone by, when there were few or no teachers, then teaching was a number one focus. Today, where there are many different opportunities for teaching, well, the kind of teaching that we used to do 50 or 60 years ago is modified into another kind of thing that helps us to be more faithful to reaching out to the people who need teaching, who are marginalized today by necessity or what have you. So the charism is alive, you know, and it is always for others. It is not just something we possess and we hold on to. It is something for others, and therefore it has to be relevant to the lives of the other and not just relevant to our lives.
Thank you, Tony. Well, Tony, incredibly stimulating conversation. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone, for the questions. Just a few notes here. One is we will follow up today's presentation with an email so that you can give us feedback on this presentation. Second, there will be a second webinar given by Tony on April 7th. And on that day, he's going to be really talking about this question of interculturality, but more focusing on the how and the who. That's on April 7th, 2 p.m. And the registration link will be in the follow-up email to you. A number of people have asked about the handout or the PowerPoint. Again, we didn't really have a PowerPoint presentation. What we had was Tony's handouts that I was simply sharing through as a PDF file. And I'll attach those again to the follow-up email. And of course, it costs money to put on these webinars. So if you're able to, we'd really appreciate a contribution to our efforts to make these webinars available to you. So with that, we're going to be ending our webinar. We have a tradition in USCMA, and that tradition is, we call it kind of the after meeting. And so I'm going to stop the recording. And once the recording is over with, if you need to depart because you have other things to do, feel free to do that. And if you want to stay and chit-chat, again, feel free to do that. So on behalf of the USCMA, Tony, thank you very much. It was a very stimulating presentation.
Thank you.
I'm really hungry to look into your book. Again, in the email, you'll find out if you'd like to order Tony's book. Liturgical Press is giving us a 20% discount on Tony's book, plus free shipping. So you'll have information about that. Tony also has 2 other books published by Liturgical Press, and they too will are available for that discount. So with that, God bless you. Thank you very much. Interculturality is both frightening and exhilarating. So enjoy the journey. This is a production of USCMA, dedicated to mission animation through the engagement and renewal of Catholic missionaries. USCMA is funded by its members and generous donors. To learn more, visit USCMA's website at www.uscatholicmission.org. Thank you, and God bless.